Animation has a rich and fascinating history. I thought it would be fun to do a brief history lesson about the use of cells in classic 2D animation. Just so we're all on the same page, animation cells are sheets of transparent celluloid to which animated cartoon characters are painted on and photographed to create the illusion of movement. And just so you're also aware from the start, we're going to be talking a lot about the Disney studio because, well, they're one of the studios who made the biggest contributions to the advancement of animation. The first use of celluloid cells in animation was actually for backgrounds. Originally, characters were inked and animated on sheets of rice paper, and a static background was drawn on a sheet of celluloid, which was then laid over the animation to complete the scene. This was an extremely cheap and effective method of animating, but it had one enormous downside. It meant restricting the character's movements to wide, empty spaces, and it limited the potential of background details. An alternate method to overcome this was to actually trace the background onto each frame of character animation. Winsor Mccay, an early pioneer of personality animation, preferred this method because he felt it breathed life into his work. In one of his first films, Gertie the Dinosaur, Mccay redrew the background for every single frame of the 5 minutes of animation. However, it was tedious, painstaking, and difficult to maintain consistency. Credit is given to Earl Hurd in 1914 as the inventor of the traditional cel animation process. Instead of painting the background on celluloid and laying it on top of the animation, Earl switched it so that the animation was laid on top of a static background. This way, the background remains constant while the cartoon character can move around in front of it. This process became the preferred method of traditional animation until the advent of specialized computer software almost 70 years later. When rough animation was cleaned up, cells were laid over the drawings and the outlines were inked. When this had dried, cells were then flipped over and the backs were painted. Painting the back of the cell helps keep the colors looking constant, smooth, and helps conceal paint mistakes. In the early days, the only colors needed to paint were black and white. When color film was developed, new methods of painting had to be created too. Characters had to be broken down to extremely specific color combinations so that the exact same color could be reproduced days or even months later. And one of the largest roles that women had during the early days of animation was in the painting of cells. Originally, men were thought to be the only ones good enough to produce the hard, constant outlines demanded in those early cartoons. But the Walt Disney Studio was one of the first to hire women for inking and painting. Walt believed that women were better at inking delicate line work than men were, and they were more skilled at blending the colors. In fact, women actually applied makeup to the top of cells of Snow White, just like they would apply makeup to themselves. Often, these little touches were not asked for by Walt or the animators, and were intended to make each frame resonate with perfection, a high standard of quality that would soon become an industry norm. One of the drawbacks of using cells was image fogging. Cells are transparent, but if you stack too many of them up, light passing through starts to become diffused, producing a foggy or blurry effect. Not only that, but the same color on a lower cell would look darker than one on a cell positioned at the top of a stack. Because of this, animators had to find out ways to keep the number of cells being photographed to a minimum. The cost of production and the issue of fogging would later influence limited animation, but unfortunately that's another subject for another time. Cells were originally made out of real celluloid, the same material used to make film strips, but this proved to be very flammable, and eventually was replaced around 1934 with cellulose acetate. Because animation studios had such a high volume of art that needed to be created, cells were often reused a lot. When the animation was done, these cells were either thrown out, or, in the usual case, wiped clean and reused for the next film. Because of the rarity of finding cells from these cartoons, they've become something of collector's items today. In 1938, Chester Carlson invented the photocopying technique of Xeroxing, which allows images to be copied from one source to another. Xeroxing is common now, but at the time it was quite revolutionary, especially for the animation industry. Rather than hand inking each cell, the original cleaned-up artwork itself could be mechanically copied onto the cells. UB Iwerks is attributed to having used the process first for the purpose of animation to speed up production. The Xeroxing process was later adapted by the Disney studio and was used extensively in 101 Dalmatians, for obvious reasons, and would soon become the preferred method of transferring cell outlines. Prior to the Xeroxing process, outlines were inked by hand, and they often used various colors. For example, if a character had red hair, the ink outline would also be red. Using colors for the outlines made the characters soft, warm, and believable. When the Xeroxing process became the norm, colored outlines had to be abandoned for the simpler black outline. This technical limitation affected how studios styled their cartoons. From 101 Dalmatians onward, cartoons from the Disney studio took on rougher, newspaper illustration-like styles, mostly due to the fact that the Xeroxing process wasn't exactly very clean. Sometimes animation guidelines and pencil marks were copied as well. In addition, many backgrounds were designed to look like the Xerox cells by painting them with color and then layering a line art cell over it. I think it's worth pointing out that while the Xeroxing process made copying and line work quicker, the cells themselves still needed to be colored. So while taking the time to paint the outlines became obsolete, painting the backs of the cells was still incredibly vital. Cel animation remained largely unchanged for many years until around the mid-1980s, when computer graphics started becoming more prominent. To help increase production of painting cells, the Walt Disney Studio worked with a very young Pixar to produce CAPS. CAPS, which stands for Computer Animated Production System, allows for the painting of cells to be much more efficient. Each drawing from an animation could be scanned into a computer, colored, and then composited with a background digitally. A wide range of visual effects like color blending, an infinite color palette, the elimination of the cell fogging problem, and the ability to create exceptionally large multiplane camera pans made the CAPS system invaluable. First tested briefly on The Little Mermaid, the first entirely digital animated film was The Rescuers Down Under in 1990. Another advantage, long lost, was the ability to color the outlines again. A technique that was abandoned long ago suddenly found itself home again in the digital age. However, while the Walt Disney Studio made the switch to digital inking and painting for their features, it took the rest of the industry a lot longer to catch up. Saturday morning television shows, which were usually inked and painted in foreign countries, continued to use traditional hand-painted cells as recent as 2004. Many filmmakers also didn't want to make the switch to digital because they felt that the 2D animation looked synthetic and lost the aesthetic appeal of the craft. The Simpsons, for example, were still making their episodes with hand-painted cells even when all-digital shows like Futurama were first appearing. In Japan, painting cells continued in feature films as late as 1997. As cost of production for hand-painted cells went up and the cost of doing the same thing digitally went down, eventually painting cells on the computer simply became the preferred method by everyone in the industry. Princess Mononoke is one of the last major feature films to utilize traditional hand-painted cel animation, and the movie itself, ironically, contains a handful of digital shots. Painting 2D animation on the computer simply became much easier to do, and like all technology, it continues to evolve. Digital cells were originally garish and harsh, but as the technology improved, the quality did too, and now the level of detail that can be achieved in the digital realm far exceeds what was possible almost a century ago. So that's the history of traditional hand-painted cells from its conception in the early 20th century to its eventual demise in the mid-1990s. I want to give people a glimpse into the rich lineage that 2D animation has and how various new techniques have shaped the medium over time. I hope that this was educational as well as entertaining, and I hope that the next time you watch an old Bugs Bunny cartoon or classic Disney movie, you think of some of those things that I touched upon and appreciate the craft that went into making those films.